So today, my group and I would like to like to address the topic of gun control laws. And first, I'd like to start by introducing our members. I'm Alec. There's Nick, Faison, and Sasha. And two of us are going to be arguing for gun control, and two of us are going to be arguing against it. So, when you see a civilian carrying a gun, do you feel threatened or safe? Does the ownership of a weapon create a more hostile or a safer environment? And with the ownership of guns, the safety of the general public may increase. However, it may also have adverse effects. Should the government implement laws enforcing gun control? So we've conducted thorough research from various sources on different arguments in favor and against these laws. And regardless of your stance on the issue, you will be affected by the decision to be made on it. And the use of gun control laws, or lack thereof, will affect your perception of how safe you really are. Now, on the con side, which will be argued by Nick and Faison, the Second Amendment already prevents owners from possessing firearms used for unlawful purposes. More control over gun ownership will not stop criminals from gaining ownership. It'll only stop lawful citizens who actually use them properly. Now, people have the right to protect themselves, especially when the police are not able to respond right away. And on the pro side, argued by me and Sasha, the Second Amendment does not permit civilians to possess a firearm, whenever or wherever they please. Gun control will decrease the amount of gun-related deaths, as they lead to both homicide and suicide-related deaths. And most victims do not utilize guns to protect themselves from a threat, so increasing gun control will have a negligent effect overall. So the first argument that's going to be made is Faison against gun control.
Okay, so my first argument is that the Second Amendment protects individual gun ownership. The Second Amendment allows for an individual's right to own a gun, and citizens are given the right to bear arms, and we can see this in the court case between the District of Columbia versus Heller. This case is about the District of Columbia putting a ban on owning and registering of handguns. The chief of police was the only person allowed to provide permission for owning a gun for a one-year period. A policeman named Heller sought to register his handgun but was denied by the state. He argued that under the Second Amendment he was allowed to own a gun. The courts ended up ruling in favor of Heller and said that he was correct and that the Second Amendment grants him that right for protection and under lawful purposes. So essentially, we are given this right in our Constitution for our protection and as well as use in other legal activities, and shouldn't have to worry about this right being taken from us.
Now, Faison, to argue that point, some countries with more restrictive gun control laws have lower gun homicide and suicide rates than the United States. So, for example, Switzerland, who's ranked third in gun ownership with 45.7 guns per 100 people, a small arms survey in 2009 said that there's 0.31 per 100,000 people in terms of gun homicides and 3.29 per 100,000 people involved in gun suicides. And the U.S. is ranked first in gun ownership overall, with rates of 88.8 guns per 100 people. And in 2007, an article under aggression and violent behavior stated that the U.S. had 4.19 deaths per 100,000 people involving gun homicides and 5.76 deaths per 100,000 people involving gun suicides. So now this is because the U.S. has very permissive gun control regulations as it is, whereas Switzerland has more extensive background testing before issuing a gun license. Now, this brings me to my second point of more gun control laws would reduce gun deaths overall. Now, the Center for Disease Control reported that there were 464,033 total gun deaths between 1999 and 2013. Now, 58.2% of those total deaths were were suicides. 37.7% of them were homicides, and 2.2% of those deaths were unintentional. Now, guns were the leading cause of death by homicide at 66.6% of all homicides and 52.2% of all suicides. Firearms were the 12th leading cause of all deaths representing 1.3% of total deaths, topping liver disease, hypertension, and Parkinson's disease, as well as natural deaths, natural disaster deaths, I suppose, ranging from fires, drowning, and machinery accidents. Guns are a huge cause of violent crime, and they need to be dealt with. They are used in a great deal of deaths and shouldn't be left uncontrolled.
Okay, Alec, to counter that last point, I'd like to say that gun control laws do not deter crime, gun ownership deters crime. In John Lott Jr.'s book, More Guns, Less Crime, Lott says that since gun control became limited in Canada in 1998, the homicide rate has risen while the United States homicide rate has fallen. The author also states when handguns were banned in Britain in 1997, the crime rate nearly doubled. Serious violent crime rates from 1997 to 2002 averaged 29% higher than in 1996. Robbery was 24% higher, and murders were 27% higher. Before the new gun law changed, armed robberies had fallen by 50% from 1993 to 1997. But as soon as handguns were banned, the armed robbery rate shot back up, almost back to their levels in 1993, prior to the change. And now the violent crime rate in England is double that of the United States. In another article, The Great Gun Control Fallacy, journalist Thomas Sewell notes that under Britain's gun control laws, armed robberies have increased from a dozen per year in the 90s to over hundreds per year in the present time. He also explains comparisons of gun ownership within different countries. For example, ownership is 3 times as high in Switzerland as it is in Germany, but the Swiss have had lower murder rates yet still. This shows that gun control does not have a relation to the prevalence of crimes. They're actually 2 independent variables. The next point I'd like to bring up is that gun control laws infringe upon the right to self-defense and moreover deny people the right to feel a sense of safety. Gun control laws, the National Rifle Association and the Gun Owners America Association claim that guns are used in self-defense 2.5 million times per year, whereas 6,850 times per day. According to the Armed Criminals in America in May 2013 surveyed, 48% of surveyed convicts admit that they avoided committing a crime when they knew the victim was armed with a gun. Civilian gun ownership is necessary to deter criminals from carrying out their crimes because they're less likely to if they feel that their life is threatened in committing the crime themselves.
On the other hand, guns are rarely used in self-defense. Gun holders are actually far more likely to hurt themselves than someone else with it. And the Violence Policy Center also concluded that guns are far more likely to be stolen than used for self-defense. As stated in Firearm Violence by BJS.gov, between 2007 and 2011, less than 1% of violent crimes involved victims that protected themselves with a firearm. It was actually the least employed protective behavior. So people aren't utilizing the firearms in the main way that has been the most argued reason for having them. Also, research conducted by VSP.org found that in 2010, there were only 230 justifiable homicides in which a citizen used a firearm to kill a felon. So if all of this research discredits the fact that most guns are not used for self-defense, why continue allowing them to be purchased when they're clearly not being used properly? And the final reason for gun control laws is that these laws would reduce the societal costs associated with gun violence. A lot of money goes into not only monitoring and preventing gun violence, but also dealing with the aftermath, whether that be health-related, economical, and even psychological. According to the World Health Organization, the cost of gun violence can include legal services, medical costs, perpetrator control, incarceration, psychological costs, among many others. So there are so many repercussions associated with guns that not only directly affect the individuals involved, but also spread even further and affect the country as a whole. Additionally, the costs are immense. According to the Pacific Institute of Research and Evaluation, gun violence costs the U.S. government $5.5 billion in lost tax revenue, along with $4.7 billion in court costs and billions and millions for other costs. These costs are extremely high and clearly shows that something needs to be changed in order to correct for these costs. So as you can see, you can't really ignore the monetary and psychological and physical effects, which could last for decades.
Gun control laws such as background checks and microstamping are an invasion of privacy, though. Background checks would require government databases that keep personal information on gun owners, including their name, addresses, mental health history, criminal records, and more. No information online is 100% safe and would be accessible. That information could be accessible to any determined individual that have the ability to hack those systems, as well as government officials who are not law-abiding. According to journalist Amber Phillips in her article, gun control legislation probably isn't going anywhere in Congress. There's a potential worry that there will be searches of the databases and an expansion for purposes that were not intended when the information was initially collected. This misuse of data is something we've all seen on the news and is definitely an issue you'd want to avoid. In addition, microstamping similarly requires a database of gun owners and the codes on their personal guns stamped on their cartridge cases. Senators Rand Paul, Mike Lee, and Ted Cruz wrote that they would oppose any legislation that infringes on the American people's constitutional right to bear arms or on their ability to exercise this right without being subjected to government surveillance. The right to bear arms should not mean that anyone who owns a weapon should be under surveillance. That is a direct invasion of our privacy because of a basic right that's given to us all. So, in conclusion, the topic of gun control is definitely very detailed and requires an in-depth analysis. Our pro side argues countries with restrictive gun control laws have lower gun homicide and suicide rates than the United States. Additionally, gun control will lower gun-related deaths on average. Firearms are already not utilized the majority of the time during a violent threat, so increasing regulation will not make a huge impact in that sense. And also, having more gun control laws would reduce societal costs in relation to gun violence. Alternatively, the con side to gun control has argued that the Second Amendment protects the individual's right to bear arms. Additionally, more control will not stop criminals if they are really determined to possess a gun. And finally, firearms should be an option for civilians to protect themselves when the police are not able to assist immediately. Gun control laws are an invasion of privacy. At the end of the day, though, gun control is a very complex issue, but most importantly, it's in the hands of you, the public, to decide how to ensure our safety.